Hey Fish Fam! Today we're going to look at tricks for working with acrylic. I'm going to be using just some acrylic sheeting to make the lids for this tank here. There are a lot of other things that people use. Usually when you go and you buy one, you get glass. A lot of people use corrugated plastic. Glass, it's really... Get off the microphone. Glass, it's really hard to cut what you need out of it. And corrugated plastic has a lot of gaps in the sides, so if you I'm using it instead of some of the other alternatives that people use because glass is rather hard to work with, and the corrugated plastic that you see a lot of people use really doesn't seal very well. It is pretty cheap, it is pretty easy to work with, but I'm looking at reducing the cost of running this tank. So the very first thing that I need to do is be adding in a lid. So we're going to be looking at ways that you can cut acrylic, ways that you can deal with splits, and things that you need to watch out for. The opening for my tank, where I'm going to be putting this, is 15 inches. Now, when you buy this, it's a good idea to get this cut ahead of time at the hardware store. They will usually do that for free. They'll usually have specialized tools for doing that, where they can get a very deep score and they can get a very clean break, and that way you can actually make use of your waste pieces if you want. When you do it yourself, as often as not, you'll end up with these breaking into pieces instead of snapping cleanly, and I'll show you that after I do one of these that hopefully works well. If none of them work well, then I guess that will sort of prove my point. You can draw a line and try to freehand this. I always hate doing that because the tools that you use for cutting tend to walk a little bit. The acrylic cutting tools are sort of a knife blade with a little jagged edge on the back here, and this jagged edge catches the acrylic and tears into it. So you go sharp point down and drag this way. And because this piece of metal is sharpened unevenly on each side, it will have a tendency to pull away while you're working with it. So if you have something you can push against to make sure that it stays straight, you'll just save yourself a lot of headache. I also like to have the straight edge because it does help a little bit with snapping it afterwards. Now, you want to clamp the straight edge in place. Clamps have various strengths. These are pretty strong. These larger ones are sort of garbagey. So I'm using 2 on this side and hoping that that will hold well enough that it won't go walking off on me. But it probably won't. When you go to score this, you're hooked down and you're just going to drag along the seam here, and it will start just ripping threads of plastic out. The more of these that you do, the easier your break will go, because just a surface score is fine for glass. Glass has a high compression on the top, so a score is enough to break it. This stuff is finicky. The deeper you can get this cut, the better off you are. You can see that's about 1/6 of the way through. That is the minimum that I generally consider okay for this. I'm going to go ahead and do this several more times now that I've got a base groove here. I don't need the straight edge, but I'm going to keep working on this until it's about 1/4 of the way through. You don't need really a lot of pressure when you do this. You just let the tool drag itself through. It will remove plastic as it goes. If you put a lot of pressure into it, it doesn't really remove a whole lot more. It just tends to get caught up, and it tends to cause divots and things. Okay, so I've got a pretty good score at this point. I'm going to line this up with the edge of my desk. This might not look like the edge of my desk because it looks like it's out here, but there's a ridge up here that's a sharp corner. That's what I'm going to be going for. In order to try to salvage as much of this free area as I can, I'm going to be putting my straight edge on it so that when I put a downward force on it, it will distribute across the entire plate here instead of just where I'm pushing. I've got another one I'm going to go ahead and show you where I did this without doing this, just so you can see what'll happen and how you can go about cleaning up the edges. I can't make any guarantees about this working smoothly because acrylic just sort of does what it feels like despite your best efforts when it comes to the actual snap. But this should go pretty painlessly. Yep. Okay, so you can see here I've got a nice clean edge where it broke, but I'm going to go ahead and show you how the other one went without this straight edge with basically the same prep work, just so that you can see, you know, even when you do this pretty frequently, it's something that happens. Once you've got your base cut done, you're going to need to make your holes for filtration, heater cables, things like that. You can see this sheet is not large enough. I'm going to have to do another sheet here to fill this gap in. I'm going to have to do the same thing on the other side. You can see here there's a temporary sheet of the thin stuff that I had laying around to keep the fish from jumping out. The jack that's in here is quite a jumper and quite a splasher. The thin stuff has a tendency to warp horribly. You can see I've glued some wooden chopsticks to it to kind of keep more of a rigid shape to it so it didn't just fall in the water. Sorry, that's kind of off topic there. So I like to just get, you know, a dry erase marker and mark basically where I'm going to be. I like to give myself a little bit of extra room because, you know, this may move a little bit. It gives a little bit less hassle putting it back in, and it gives a little bit better air exchange. You still want a good oxygen flow going into the tank. You just don't want to be losing all the moisture. Okay, so I've got my basic width marked out. I'm going to go ahead and mark my depth. I'm cutting this 2 inches, which is about ½ an inch more than I need, just because I want to make sure I have clearance. It also makes it a lot easier when I want to do feeding. You know, I do cichlid pellets pretty frequently for the fish that are in here right now. I've got a jack and what I'm pretty sure is a red Texas that's not displaying any red. And they can get cranky and splashy if I open the lid to feed them. So if I can just slide it around the filter, then it keeps me much drier and keeps them quite a bit happier. Just go straight across. Now, once you've got your cutout marked, the next thing is actually getting rid of it. And there's several ways that you can do this. The first one is you can get something like the acrylic cutting tool and you can just keep cutting at it until you make it all the way through. That will take an enormous amount of time and it will probably blister your hands quite badly, but it is something that you can do. You can, if you have an enormous amount of patience, try to cut at this with a hacksaw, but that's generally not worth it. So what I like to use is either a coping saw, which is like a hacksaw but it has a much thinner blade, and it's designed to let you rotate the blade more easily so you can get into places. So with this blade I can work this way, I can rotate the entire blade assembly inside of this handle, and then I can work this way. What I generally recommend for these is, if you can get away with a straight cut, cut your sides and then score the actual length here, because scoring this will let you snap it off cleanly and you won't have to spend ½ an hour cutting. When you do cut with these, there is a direction to the serration on these blades, and I generally recommend you just pull against the serration, don't push towards it, or you'll risk putting enough pressure on this that you'll start cracking and splintering things. It takes a little bit longer to cut just from pulling, but it's not a significantly longer time, and you end up with much cleaner, much nicer edges in the long run. The other thing that you can do is, if you know somebody with a scroll saws have very thin blades and make very quick work of cutting acrylic without causing issues. If you have thicker acrylic, you can frequently use a jigsaw or a table saw or something like that, but I don't usually trust those with things that are less than 1/4 inch thick. With 1/2 inch stuff, I will usually get a thin jigsaw blade and do it by hand, but with this kind of stuff, a scroll saw or a coping saw is about as much as I'm willing to do. Now, when you're going to be doing this, you are going to have an issue here if you're going to be cutting the whole way, where you need to rotate the blade and you need room for that, so it's worth drilling a hole. So I want to take just a second before I start cutting to talk about safe ways to drill acrylic. So let's say I want a large hole so that I can do airline tubing and things like that. And I'm going to go ahead and use this scrap piece because I fully expect this to explode. And while that didn't explode, which is frankly incredibly surprising, it did twist a rather awful hole out of this. Now, one of the ways that you can try to avoid that with acrylic and exploding, I don't particularly want to drill this enough for it to explode and shatter, because it may take 2 or 3 holes before that happens. The way that you generally avoid these kinds of risks and the drill bit misbehaving and cracking your acrylic, and you can see small cracks coming out here. I did stop pretty soon. If you're not expecting it and you don't know that's going to happen, there's a very good chance you'll just rip the end off. The way that you avoid that kind of thing generally is you start with a small drill bit, usually a smaller one than this, and you just work your way up. And if you've got a full set of drill bits already that's sharp and you've got a lot of patience, there's not really an issue with that. But most people don't. So what I generally recommend is one of these stepping bits. And these are usually $5 or $6 from someplace like eBay. Hardware stores like to try to charge $40 or $50 for them because they can. But if you're not in a giant hurry, getting them online is definitely worth it. And these, you can go all the way up to whatever size the base is. This is the same size as this bit that I just used. You end up with a very nice, very clean hole instead. So you can see how much nicer that is. Now, this bit purchased online was cheaper than the bit that made this hole from a hardware store. So it's something that's worth doing. It takes a little bit of time to get through. You probably saw how incredibly long that took to drill through because it melts through as much as it cuts. But I have never had a stepping bit shatter or crack acrylic on me. So when you're working with a coping saw, make sure the blade is tight. Make sure that there's not really any flex in it. And like I said, you really just want to pull back. So start wherever your piece is. And start very slowly so that it doesn't walk all over you. Slowly straighten out, and just repeat this until you're at the depth that you want. If you're going to be trying to cut the whole thing, drill your hole first. If you cut down to it and then drill afterwards, the chances of you accidentally splitting the full length of the acrylic skyrocket. So when you're doing this, make sure you drill your hole first. Now, I'm not going to be doing this with the coping saw the whole way. I'm going to be going down, I'm going to be scoring it, and I'm going to be splitting it off. The next one that I do, I'm just going to be using my scroll saw for, because I am incredibly impatient and it's not really worth it to me to do this entire thing by hand, just because some people might. So that was about a minute of cutting. if you are used to doing it. When you're not used to doing it, it's probably about 5 minutes of cutting. If you've got an electric saw that you want to try to cut this with, you will save yourself a lot of headache if you put some masking tape over the area you're going to do. I'm not entirely sure why this makes a big difference, but it really does. When I do this, I don't get the big melted mess, and I think maybe the acrylic fuzz that ends up coming out with the saw ends up getting caught on the top of the masking tape and thrown off instead of being put back into the hole. That is much easier. So if you have a scroll saw or you know somebody with a scroll saw, that is the recommended way that I have to do this. So once you've got your side cuts and you've notched your straight here, it's exactly the same process as it is for the rest of it. Line it up on a straight edge and snap it off. Needs to finish lids in place. They fit pretty well. I like to make these so that they are reversible because even the thicker acrylics, the 1/4 inch stuff, will have a tendency to bow a little bit. So when I come in and I do my water change, I take these and I just flip them the other way around and they straighten themselves out again. This is a little bit more expensive than doing something like the corrugated plastic that a lot of the other channels suggest, but I think it looks a whole lot nicer. It costs about $60 for all of the acrylic to do this tank, but this tank was using about 9 kilowatts a day to heat previously, and with the acrylic in place, it uses about 2. So the savings that this will have in the course of a year is enormous compared to the cost of the acrylic itself. That's it for now, and we'll see you guys next time. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe. Go ahead and hit that thumbs up button.